Hey guys, tonight we begin with what it was like to be buried alive in ancient China. And trust me, it wasn't the peaceful dirt nap you might imagine. One thing's for sure, the ancient Chinese took their burial practices so seriously that sometimes they forgot to check if people were actually dead first. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because tonight, we're going underground. Literally. Let's start with the biggest misconception about ancient Chinese burial practices. Most people think being buried alive was some kind of rare, dramatic punishment reserved for the worst criminals, or maybe an occasional tragic accident. In reality, intentional live burial was a surprisingly common practice that served multiple purposes, from religious ceremonies to political statements to what can only be described as the world's most permanent employee benefits package. Think of it like modern corporate layoffs, except instead of a severance package, you got a coffin and some pottery. This wasn't some barbaric exception to otherwise civilized society. It was an organized, systematic practice with rules, rituals, and surprisingly detailed instruction manuals. The ancient Chinese were nothing if not thorough when it came to putting people 6 feet under, dead or alive. Ancient China wasn't a harmonious, wisdom-filled paradise that fortune cookies and kung fu movies might suggest. It was a complex, often brutal civilization where human life was valued differently depending on your social status, and sometimes not valued at all. The various dynasties spanning over 2 millennia controlled everything from what you ate for breakfast to how you died. And they weren't particularly concerned with your personal preferences on either matter. If you thought modern workplace hierarchies were harsh, think again. Ancient Chinese social structures made corporate America look like a casual Friday. The practice of live burial, or zunzang as it was formerly known, wasn't some underground secret society activity. It was government policy, religious doctrine, and social custom all rolled into one terrifying package. Emperors, nobles, and wealthy merchants regularly took entire households with them to the afterlife, because apparently even death couldn't cure their separation anxiety. The logic was simple. If you're important enough to need servants, guards, and concubines in life, you'll obviously need them in death too. Never mind asking these people their opinions on eternal employment. From the Shang dynasty around 1600 BCE through various periods up to the Ming dynasty, different rulers implemented live burial for different reasons. Sometimes it was religious, ensuring the deceased had proper company in the afterlife. Sometimes it was political, making sure certain people couldn't cause trouble after the boss died. And sometimes it was just practical, because training new staff in the afterlife would probably be a real hassle. The Chinese approached death with the same organizational efficiency they brought to everything else, which unfortunately meant that dying became just another bureaucratic process. Enter Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, and a man who took taking it with you when you go to absolutely legendary levels. This guy didn't just want to be buried with his treasures. He wanted to recreate his entire empire underground, complete with staff. But here's the twist. Qin Shi Huang was so paranoid about secrets getting out that he ordered all the workers who built his tomb to be buried alive with him, essentially turning his funeral into the world's first and most permanent non-disclosure agreement. The poor craftsmen who spent years creating the famous terracotta army probably thought they were just doing some really detailed sculpture work. Little did they know they were essentially building their own elaborate graveyards. According to historical records, thousands of workers, stonemasons, artists, engineers, and general laborers were sealed inside the tomb complex while still breathing. The emperor's logic was bulletproof. Dead men tell no tales, especially about where all the good stuff is buried. But if you think that's extreme, wait until you hear about the concubines. The emperor's numerous wives and concubines who hadn't produced children were considered useless for continuing the royal line, so naturally they got the express ticket to the afterlife too. One historical account suggests that over 3,000 people were buried alive in Qin Shi Huang's tomb complex. That's like burying an entire small town, which makes you wonder if anyone actually showed up to his funeral voluntarily. It's the ultimate example of, if you can't live without them, make sure they can't live without you either. This wasn't just about one paranoid emperor's extreme funeral arrangements. Live burial represented the ultimate expression of power. In ancient Chinese society, the ability to determine not just how people lived, but how and when they died. The practice affected everyone from imperial concubines to common soldiers, from skilled craftsmen to household servants. Your social status determined whether you died naturally or got volunteered for eternal service. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine living your entire life, knowing that your value to society might literally be measured by how useful you'd be as a corpse. Servants lived with the constant possibility that their boss's death sentence could become their own. Craftsmen working on important projects knew that finishing their masterpiece might mean signing their own death warrant. And concubines understood that failing to produce an heir wasn't just career suicide. It was actual suicide, courtesy of the state. This practice shaped Chinese culture, politics, and social relationships for millennia. It affected how people formed relationships, chose careers, and navigated court politics. When your employer's mortality could directly impact your own, every workplace interaction took on life or death significance, literally. But imperial paranoia and religious devotion were just the beginning. The practice of live burial extended far beyond royal tombs and involved elaborate rituals, specific techniques, and surprisingly detailed protocols. What happened to these people once they were underground? How did they prepare for their involuntary journey to the afterlife? The actual procedures for live burial in ancient China weren't just dig hole, insert person, cover with dirt. Unlike what you might assume from horror movies or your worst nightmares, these were elaborate, carefully orchestrated ceremonies with more protocols than a modern airline boarding process. The Chinese, being the efficiency experts they were, had turned what should have been a chaotic, horrifying experience into a well-organized, horrifying experience. The practice evolved over centuries into a sophisticated system with different methods for different social classes, occasions, and purposes. Think of it as a macabre version of wedding planning. There were consultants, usually priests or court officials, detailed timelines, specific burial goods, and even dress codes. The only difference was that instead of "till death do us part," it was more like "till death do us all part," whether we like it or not. There were essentially three main categories of live burial: voluntary, and we'll use that term very loosely, sacrificial, and punitive. Voluntary usually meant volunteer or we'll make it worse for you and your family. Sacrificial was the religious or ceremonial version, often tied to ensuring the deceased had proper company in the afterlife. Punitive was straightforward punishment, though the line between justice and revenge was about as clear as mud in ancient China. The preparation process could take weeks or even months. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was planned, with the same attention to detail as a military campaign. Lists were made of who needed to go, what they should wear, what grave goods they'd need, and in what order they'd be buried. Imagine being handed a schedule that included your own funeral as the final agenda item. The administrative efficiency was almost as terrifying as the actual burial. What made this particularly Chinese was the emphasis on maintaining social hierarchy, even in death. Emperors got elaborate tomb complexes with multiple chambers. Nobles got smaller versions. Common people got, well, common holes in the ground. But everyone got buried according to strict protocols that reflected their status in life. Because apparently, even death couldn't escape the class system. Take the case of Duke Ling of Wei, who died in 493 BCE, according to the historical records. His funeral became a masterclass in excessive live burial. The Duke had been particularly fond of his musicians. Apparently, he enjoyed entertainment so much that he couldn't imagine an afterlife without his personal orchestra. So naturally, his entire musical ensemble got invited to the eternal concert. The preparation began months before the actual burial. Court officials drew up lists of who would accompany the Duke, what instruments they'd bring, because you can't have a proper afterlife concert without proper instruments, and even what songs they should be prepared to play. The musicians were told they were being honored with eternal service, which was probably small comfort when they realized what eternal service actually meant. On the day of the burial, the musicians were dressed in their finest performance robes and given their instruments. They were led into the tomb complex in a formal procession, probably the most depressing parade in history. Once inside, they were arranged in their traditional performance formation around the Duke's coffin. Then came the ceremonial sealing, essentially being walled up alive in what amounted to the world's most permanent concert venue. One historical account describes how the musicians continued playing as the tomb entrances were sealed, creating what must have been the most haunting soundtrack imaginable. The music gradually faded as the air grew thin, which gives a whole new meaning to the phrase playing until the bitter end. The Duke got his eternal entertainment, and the musicians got job security that lasted literally forever. Another fascinating example involves Emperor Wu of Han's burial preparation in 87 BCE. This emperor was particularly paranoid about tomb robbers, so he devised what he considered the perfect security system. Bury the architects and engineers alive, so they couldn't reveal the tomb's secrets or hidden entrances. It was like having the ultimate security clearance, the kind you literally can't survive to violate. The engineering team that designed the tombs, elaborate trap systems and hidden passages, was told they were working on the most important project of their careers. They spent years creating intricate mechanisms designed to protect the emperor's treasures from thieves. What they didn't know was that they were also designing their own prison. The irony was thick enough to cut with a sword. The very people who created the tomb's defenses became its final victims. The burial process for these craftsmen was particularly elaborate because they were considered essential personnel. Each was buried with their tools, presumably so they could continue maintenance work in the afterlife. One engineer was buried with his complete set of measuring instruments, another with his architectural plans carved on bronze tablets. They were essentially being prepared for an eternal work assignment, because apparently even death couldn't guarantee time off. Perhaps most disturbing was the case of the 21 concubines of Emperor Taizu of Ming, who were buried alive in 1398. These women were told they were being selected for a special honor, which should have been the first red flag. But in Imperial China, questioning royal honors was generally not advised. They were given their finest silk robes, their most precious jewelry, and what they thought was preparation for important ceremony. The ritual took place in the imperial tomb complex, with each woman assigned a specific position around the emperor's burial chamber. They were seated on elaborate chairs, given cups of wine, probably drugged, and told to wait for the ceremony to begin. The ceremony, of course, was their own burial. As the tomb entrances were sealed, these women realized that their honor was becoming a living nightmare. Some historical accounts suggest they continued calling out for hours after the sealing, their voices gradually fading as the air ran out. But it wasn't that simple. and with ancient China, it never was. The practice of live burial was riddled with contradictions that would make even the most flexible philosopher's head spin. For instance, Confucian philosophy, which dominated Chinese intellectual life, emphasized the value of human life and the importance of family relationships. Yet the same culture that produced these beautiful ideals about human dignity also systematically buried people alive for centuries. Different dynasties had completely different approaches to the practice. The Shang dynasty treated it as a religious necessity. You simply couldn't properly honor the dead without providing them with living companions. The Qin dynasty used it primarily as a tool of political control, ensuring secrets stayed. Buried and potential rivals couldn't cause trouble. The Han dynasty tried to reform the practice, introducing clay figures and other substitutes in many cases, but still maintained live burial for the most important occasions. Even more confusing was the regional variation. Northern China practiced live burial differently from southern China. Some regions emphasized the religious aspects. Others focused on the practical benefits of eliminating potential problems. Some areas had elaborate rituals that could last for days, while others preferred quick, efficient procedures. It was like having 50 different recipes for the same terrifying dish. The Buddhist influence created another layer of contradiction. Buddhism, with its emphasis on compassion and the sanctity of all life, fundamentally opposed live burial. Yet many Buddhist emperors continued the practice, creating elaborate theological justifications for why their particular version of live burial was somehow different from the general prohibition against taking life. These mental gymnastics would have impressed even the most creative modern lawyers. Perhaps most ironically, the practice was often justified as an act of mercy. Servants and concubines were told they were being spared the hardship of living without their master's protection. Court officials argued that quick death by suffocation was preferable to slow death by starvation or abuse that might await these people in the outside world. It was the ultimate example of "we're doing this for your own good." Except the recipients rarely seemed to appreciate the kindness. The economic aspects created their own contradictions. Live burial was simultaneously seen as an extravagant waste of human resources and as a practical necessity for maintaining social order. Skilled craftsmen represented years of training and significant economic value, yet they were routinely buried alive to prevent them from sharing trade secrets. It was like deliberately destroying your own infrastructure to protect it from competitors. The result was a society living in constant awareness that death could be contagious, that someone else's mortality might become your own problem. The psychological impact rippled through every level of Chinese society, creating a culture where personal relationships were always shadowed by the possibility of involuntary martyrdom. Servants developed elaborate strategies for avoiding assignments that might lead to burial duty. Court historians recorded cases of skilled craftsmen deliberately doing mediocre work on important projects, reasoning that if their work wasn't too impressive, they might be allowed to live and work on the next project. It was the ultimate example of strategic underachievement. Being too good at your job could literally be a death sentence. The families of those selected for live burial faced their own horrible choices. They could protest and risk being buried themselves, or they could accept the honor and lose their loved ones. Most chose silent acceptance, leading to generations of families who learned to celebrate their mediocrity. Why stand out when standing out might mean standing 6 feet underground? Court officials responsible for organizing these burials developed what could only be described as professional detachment. They created detailed manuals covering everything from the proper order of burial to the appropriate grave goods for different social classes. These bureaucrats turned mass murder into paperwork, complete with forms, procedures, and quality control measures. They were like event planners for the apocalypse. Some rulers eventually recognized the economic waste involved in live burial and attempted reforms. Emperor Wu of Han tried to substitute clay figures for living people in many ceremonies, leading to the development of increasingly sophisticated burial art. However, these reforms were often ignored when it came to really important burials. The clay figures were fine for minor nobles, but emperors still wanted the real deal, the international. Consequences were significant too. Foreign ambassadors and traders who witnessed these practices spread word of Chinese barbarity throughout Asia and beyond. This created a diplomatic challenge for Chinese courts, who had to balance their domestic traditions with their international reputation. Some dynasties tried to hide the practice from foreign visitors, while others used it as a form of intimidation, a reminder of what happened to people who crossed the Chinese Empire. Religious communities struggled with how to respond. Buddhist and Taoist monks often found themselves in the impossible position of serving rulers who demanded their spiritual blessing for practices that violated their fundamental beliefs. Some monks refused and faced punishment themselves, while others developed elaborate theological justifications that would have made medieval Catholic scholastics proud. Meanwhile, the actual experience of being buried alive was developing its own horrifying folklore and surprisingly detailed documentation. The Chinese, being thorough record keepers, didn't just document who was buried and why. They also recorded what happened during the burial process itself, creating a historical archive that reads like a collection of the world's most disturbing instruction manuals. But the administrative side of mass live burial was only part of the story. The human experience, what it actually felt like to be selected, prepared, and buried alive, created its own complex web of psychological adaptation, resistance, and survival strategies. Some people found ways to escape their fate, others accepted it with resignation, and a few even embraced it as a form of religious transcendence. The variety of human responses to this ultimate horror reveals as much about the Chinese character as it does about the practice itself. And then there were the technical challenges. How do you efficiently bury hundreds of people alive? What's the best way to prevent escape attempts? How do you maintain the ceremony's dignity while essentially committing mass murder? These weren't just philosophical questions. They were practical problems that required practical solutions, leading to innovations that were as ingenious as they were terrifying. The Chinese approach to live burial became a case study in how human ingenuity can be applied to absolutely any problem, no matter how morally questionable. If the burial procedures were a masterclass in organized horror, then the social hierarchy of who got buried alive was a fascinating study in institutionalized inequality that made modern workplace discrimination look like a minor scheduling conflict. Ancient Chinese society didn't just have different rules for different classes when it came to living. They had completely different rules for dying too. And unfortunately, those rules often involved not getting to choose when your dying happened. The selection process for live burial wasn't random, accidental, or even particularly based on criminal behavior. It was a carefully calculated system that reflected social status, personal relationships, economic value, and political usefulness. Think of it as the world's most permanent performance review, where getting fired meant getting buried. Your position in society determined not just how you lived, but whether you got to die naturally or got volunteered for eternal service. What made this particularly Chinese was the emphasis on maintaining social order, even in death arrangements. There were specific protocols for which types of people could be buried with which types of rulers, what their roles would be in the afterlife, and even what positions they should occupy in the tomb layout. It was like a deadly game of chess where everyone except the king was expendable, and even the king eventually lost. The hierarchy wasn't just about who lived and who died. It was about how they died, where they died, what they died with, and what their death was supposed to accomplish. Emperor's concubines got elaborate burial chambers with silk robes and precious jewelry. Skilled craftsmen got buried with their tools. Common soldiers got mass graves. Criminals got whatever was left. Over. Everyone got dead, but some got dead with considerably more style than others. This system created what could only be described as a pyramid scheme where death was the ultimate product being sold. At the top, you had emperors who demanded extensive afterlife staffing. In the middle, you had nobles and officials who selected who would provide that staffing. At the bottom, you had everyone else who discovered that their main job qualification was being expendable. It was social stratification taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. If you weren't important enough to make the life or death decisions, you became someone else's life or death decision. Consider the tragic case of Lady Qi, one of Emperor Gaozu's favorite concubines during the Han Dynasty. When the emperor died in 195 BCE, Lady Qi found herself in what you might call an extremely awkward position. She had been the emperor's beloved companion, but she had also made some serious enemies among the other imperial women, particularly Empress Laji. The empress had a long memory and an even longer list of grudges. Lady Qi was initially told she would be honored with burial alongside the emperor, which should have been her first clue that something was wrong. In imperial China, when someone started talking about honoring you after the boss died, it usually meant updating your resume for the afterlife. The empress personally oversaw Lady Qi's preparation for burial, which involved dressing her in magnificent silk robes, adorning her with precious jade jewelry, and providing her with all the comforts she would need for eternal service. The ceremony itself was conducted with full imperial honors. Lady Qi was escorted to the tomb complex by a procession of court officials, musicians and mourners who were probably relieved they weren't on the burial list themselves. She was seated in an elaborate chair within the emperor's burial chamber, surrounded by other concubines who had been selected for the same honor. According to historical accounts, Lady Qi maintained her dignity throughout the process, possibly because she understood that complaining about imperial honors was generally not a career-enhancing move. But here's where it gets particularly Chinese. Even as Lady Qi was being buried alive, the ceremony maintained all the proper protocols for her social status. She was buried with the correct number of servants, also alive, the appropriate grave goods for imperial concubine, and in the exact position within the tomb that reflected her rank in the imperial hierarchy. Her murder was committed with absolute attention to proper etiquette. Another fascinating example involves the mass burial that accompanied the death of Duke Mu of Qin in 621 BCE. This duke had been particularly successful in battle, largely due to his excellent military advisors and skilled generals. When he died, the decision was made that his military success should continue in the afterlife, which meant his entire general staff got volunteered for eternal military service. The selection process was remarkably systematic. The duke's most trusted generals were chosen first, followed by his tactical advisors, then his personal guards, and finally his weapon specialists. It was like a military reorganization chart, except instead of new assignments, everyone got the same assignment: death. Each man was told he was being selected for the ultimate honor, continuing to serve his commander in the next world. The burial ceremony itself was organized like a military operation. The generals were arranged in formation around the duke's sarcophagus, each holding their weapons and wearing their full military regalia. Their horses were buried with them, because apparently even cavalry units needed to stay together for eternity. The advisors were positioned with their strategic maps and planning materials, ready to continue developing battle plans for whatever conflicts might arise in the afterlife. What makes this story particularly tragic is that these men were among the most capable military leaders of their time. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but a massive loss of military expertise that weakened the entire state. It was like deliberately destroying your own army to honor your dead general, which might explain why this particular practice eventually fell out of favor among strategically minded rulers. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the case of the imperial musicians during the Tang dynasty. These weren't just random entertainers. They were highly trained artists who had spent decades mastering complex musical forms. When Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE, his love of music led to the decision that his favorite musicians should accompany him to ensure proper entertainment in the afterlife. The musicians were given several weeks to prepare, which they spent composing what they called their eternal repertoire, pieces specifically created for performance in the afterlife. They practiced these compositions obsessively, apparently taking professional pride in being ready for their final concert. Some wrote letters to their families explaining their honor at being selected, while others composed farewell songs that were performed at their own burial ceremony. The actual burial was conducted like a concert performance. The musicians were positioned in their traditional formation, with string instruments on one side, wind instruments on another, and percussion in the back. They began playing as the tomb was sealed, creating a haunting soundtrack that gradually faded as the air grew thin. Court records describe it as simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrifying musical performance in Chinese history. This wasn't isolated to a few dramatic cases or particularly bloodthirsty rulers. The pattern of selecting specific social groups for live burial was consistent across different dynasties, different time periods, and different regions of China. It was as systematic as taxation and about as popular. The most common targets were always the same categories of people: concubines who hadn't produced heirs, skilled craftsmen who knew state secrets, military advisors who understood strategic plans, household servants who had intimate knowledge of their master's affairs, and musicians or entertainers who provided personal services. These weren't random selections. They were calculated decisions based on who knew too much, who would be most useful in the afterlife, and who would be least missed by the living. Concubines represented the largest single category of live burial victims, which makes sense when you consider their position in imperial society. They were valuable enough to be worth taking to the afterlife, but not valuable enough to be allowed to survive and potentially cause succession problems. They existed in a kind of social limbo where their worth was entirely tied to their relationship with the emperor, and when that relationship ended with his death, their value expired too. Skilled craftsmen were another consistent target, particularly those who worked on tombs, palaces, or military equipment. The logic was straightforward. Anyone who knew how something was built could potentially help others tear it down. Architects who designed tomb security systems, engineers who created hidden passages, and artists who knew the location of secret treasure chambers all found themselves volunteering for permanent silence. Military personnel faced their own unique risks. Generals and advisors who were too successful became targets because rulers wanted their expertise in the afterlife. Those who were unsuccessful became targets because they were expendable. It was a perfect example of the impossible position that competent people found themselves in. Being too good at your job was dangerous, but being bad at it was equally dangerous. The geographic patterns were remarkably consistent too. Northern China, with its emphasis on military tradition, tended to bury more soldiers and generals. Southern China, with its focus on culture and arts, preferred to bury musicians and scholars. But everywhere, the basic principle remained important. People needed company in death, and less important people were available to provide that company. What's particularly striking is how these patterns persisted across centuries of political change. Different dynasties had different philosophies, different religions, and different approaches to governance, but they all maintained remarkably similar approaches to live burial. It suggests that the practice filled some deep cultural need that transcended individual rulers or specific political systems. The consistency of victim selection also reveals something important about Chinese social psychology. The same categories of people who were considered indispensable in life, skilled craftsmen, trusted advisors, personal servants, were also considered indispensable in death. It was a backhanded compliment that carried a death sentence. The effects were devastating and far-reaching, creating ripple effects that shaped Chinese society for centuries. The immediate impact was the constant loss of skilled professionals, which created a kind of brain drain where the most talented people in society had the shortest life expectancy. It was like systematically destroying your own human capital. Every time someone important died, skilled craftsmen began deliberately limiting their expertise to avoid becoming too valuable. Architects learned to work in teams, so no single person knew all the secrets of a construction project. Musicians avoided becoming too closely associated with powerful patrons. It was a society where professional excellence could literally be fatal, leading to a culture of strategic mediocrity that stifled innovation and artistic development. The families of potential victims developed elaborate strategies for protecting their loved ones. Some arranged marriages that would make their family members too politically connected to sacrifice. Others made sure their skilled relatives had obvious character flaws that would make them unsuitable for eternal service. A few simply moved to remote areas where their talents wouldn't be noticed by anyone important. Enough to require burial companions. Court politics became even more treacherous than usual, as officials learned to navigate the delicate balance between being useful enough to keep their jobs and being so useful that they might be needed in the afterlife. Advisors avoided giving advice that was too good. Generals tried to win battles without being too brilliant about it. And entertainers walked the fine line between pleasing their patrons and becoming indispensable to them. The economic impact was enormous. Entire industries lost their most skilled practitioners with every major death, creating cycles of rebuilding that wasted resources and delayed technological development. The constant need to train new craftsmen, generals, and advisors meant that institutional knowledge was regularly lost, leading to a society that was always starting over. Women faced particular challenges, as concubines and female servants were among the most frequent victims of live burial. This created a gender-based mortality pattern that affected marriage customs, family planning, and women's social strategies. Some families refused to allow their daughters to enter imperial service, while others saw it as a necessary risk for social advancement. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities. Everyone knew someone who had been buried alive, creating a kind of collective trauma that influenced how people formed relationships, chose careers, and made life decisions. It was impossible to ignore the reality that your professional success might ultimately cost you your life. International relations suffered as well, as foreign diplomats and traders were horrified by the practice and used it as evidence of Chinese barbarity. This created diplomatic challenges that forced some rulers to modify or hide their burial practices when dealing with foreign powers, adding another layer of complexity to an already complicated custom. Yet, even as the social hierarchy of live burial was creating these devastating patterns of institutionalized death, individual stories of resistance, escape, and survival were beginning to emerge. Not everyone accepted their fate quietly, and the Chinese genius for problem solving began to be applied to the ultimate problem: how to avoid being buried alive when someone important decided you were needed in the afterlife. Some people developed elaborate strategies for faking their own deaths before the official burial. Others found ways to make themselves seem unsuitable for eternal service. A few managed to escape from tombs after being sealed inside, leading to ghost stories that probably weren't entirely fictional. The most successful developed political connections that made them too dangerous to bury, essentially using the same social networks that created the problem to solve it. These individual acts of resistance and survival created their own folklore, inspiring others to find creative solutions to the live burial problem. What emerged was a kind of underground survival culture where people shared information about how to avoid becoming someone else's eternal companion. It was like a medieval version of witness protection, except instead of hiding from criminals, people were hiding from their own government's funeral arrangements. The tension between institutionalized death and individual survival instincts was about to create some of the most dramatic stories in Chinese history, as people discovered that the line between life and death wasn't as fixed as their rulers believed. By 210 BCE, during the final years of the Qin dynasty, the practice of live burial had reached what could only be described as an industrial scale. That would have impressed modern efficiency experts and horrified modern human rights advocates in equal measure. Emperor Qin Shi Huang's death was approaching, and his funeral preparations had become the largest logistical undertaking in Chinese history, involving thousands of workers, hundreds of officials, and what amounted to a small army of people who were about to discover they had volunteered for permanent unemployment. The scale of the planned burial was unprecedented. Court records suggest that over 6,000 people were on the initial burial list, including the entire construction crew for the emperor's tomb, most of his concubines, his personal guard unit, his kitchen staff, his musicians, his court astronomers, and basically anyone who had ever seen the emperor without his ceremonial robes. It was like planning a funeral that would depopulate a medium-sized city, which raised some obvious logistical questions that no one seemed eager to address. The tensions had been building for months, as word of the burial plan spread through the imperial complex. Workers on the tomb project began to realize that their job security was going to be remarkably permanent. Concubines started making nervous jokes about eternal employment benefits. Palace guards found themselves wondering if their oath to protect the emperor included protecting him from loneliness in the afterlife. The entire imperial household was essentially living under a death sentence that was scheduled to be carried out as soon as the emperor stopped breathing. What made this situation particularly explosive was that many of the intended victims were skilled, intelligent people who weren't inclined to accept their fate quietly. The tomb construction crew included some of the most talented engineers and architects in the empire. The palace guard contained experienced military veterans who understood tactics and organization. The court officials responsible for implementing the burial plans were beginning to realize they were also on the list of people who knew too much to be allowed to survive. The psychological pressure was enormous. Imagine going to work every day, knowing that your boss's health directly determined your life expectancy, and that his funeral arrangements included your own death. Productivity probably wasn't at an all-time high, and workplace morale was definitely suffering. The emperor's declining health became everyone's existential crisis, creating a situation where an entire community was essentially waiting for their own execution date to be announced. The crisis reached its breaking point in early 210 BCE, when the emperor's health took a dramatic turn for the worse during a tour of the eastern provinces. Palace physicians quietly informed the senior court officials that the emperor had perhaps weeks to live, which meant the burial preparations needed to shift from planning to implementation. This was the moment when the abstract horror of live burial became immediate, practical reality for thousands of people. The first sign of trouble came from the tomb construction site, where work had essentially stopped as the workers realized their project deadline had become their death sentence. Master engineer Chen Wei, who had spent 5 years designing the tomb's elaborate drainage systems and hidden passages, called a secret meeting of the senior craftsmen. "Brothers," he reportedly said, "we have built the Emperor's eternal palace, and now we are invited to become its permanent residence. I don't know about you, but I never applied for that job." What happened next was probably inevitable, but definitely unprecedented. The construction workers, palace guards, and even some court officials began coordinating what could only be described as the world's first organized resistance to mandatory eternal employment. They had several advantages. They knew the palace layout better than anyone. They included experienced military personnel, and they had absolutely nothing to lose since they were already scheduled for execution. The plan that emerged was audaciously simple. Instead of waiting to be buried alive, they would stage a coordinated escape attempt that would coincide with the Emperor's actual death. The tomb workers would use their knowledge of the palace's hidden passages to move people out of the complex. The guards would provide security and weapons. The court officials would create bureaucratic confusion to delay the burial ceremony. It was like planning a jailbreak, except the jail was an entire imperial palace, and the warden was a dying emperor. The conspiracy grew with remarkable speed. Kitchen staff who were scheduled for burial began stockpiling food for the escape. Musicians composed songs that were actually coded messages about timing and routes. Even some of the concubines got involved, using their access to different parts of the palace to gather intelligence about security arrangements. Within weeks, what had started as a few desperate conversations had become a sophisticated underground network involving hundreds of people. The Emperor's condition provided both urgency and opportunity. As he grew weaker, security around the palace became more focused on medical care and less on monitoring potential burial victims. Palace guards were distracted by the constant movement of physicians and court officials. The normal routines that would have made escape impossible were disrupted by the chaos of managing a dying emperor's final days. The actual escape attempt began on the night of September 10th, 210 BCE, just hours after the emperor's death was officially announced. The timing was crucial. They needed to move before the burial ceremony could be organized, but after the emperor's death made their situation officially hopeless. Chen Wei and his team had spent weeks preparing hidden supply caches and mapping escape routes through the vast tomb complex they had spent years building. The escape was like something out of an action movie, except with more silk robes and ancient Chinese architecture. Groups of workers moved through hidden passages they had built into the tomb complex, emerging at predetermined points outside the palace walls. Palace guards who were part of the conspiracy created deliberate confusion, reporting false alarms, and security breaches that drew attention away from the real escape routes. Court officials delayed the official burial planning meetings, claiming they needed more time to verify the proper protocols for such an important ceremony. Master engineer Chen Wei later described the experience in letters that survived in family archives. "We moved like ghosts through passages we had built with our own hands, carrying nothing but our tools and our determination to see another sunrise. Behind us, we could hear the drums announcing the emperor's death. Ahead of us lay uncertain freedom, but even uncertainty was better than certain death." The most dramatic moment came when the escaping concubines encountered a group of loyal palace guards who weren't part of the conspiracy. Lady Ming, one of the emperor's lesser concubines, reportedly convinced the guards that they were participating in a special funeral ritual that required them to visit a shrine outside the palace. The guards, confused by the unusual circumstances and reluctant to interfere with funeral preparations, allowed the group to pass. It was quick thinking that probably saved dozens of lives, though not everyone made it. Some of the escapees were caught at the palace gates. Others were tracked down in the days following the escape attempt. But remarkably, More than half of the intended burial victims managed to slip away in the confusion, creating what amounted to the largest successful prison break in ancient Chinese history. Except the prison was an imperial palace and the crime was being scheduled for involuntary eternal employment. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Palace officials discovered that they were missing most of the people who were supposed to be buried with the emperor. The burial ceremony had to be postponed while search parties combed the countryside looking for escaped craftsmen and concubines. Some officials suggested using substitute victims, but others argued that the emperor deserved his specifically selected eternal companions, not random replacements. The response was as dramatic as the escape itself. The surviving court officials faced an impossible situation. They had lost most of the intended burial victims. The emperor was already dead and decomposing, and the funeral ceremony was becoming an international embarrassment as foreign dignitaries arrived to witness what was supposed to be the most elaborate burial in Chinese history. Crown Prince Huai, who would become the second emperor, was reportedly furious about the escape. According to court records, he declared that the escaped victims had dishonored the emperor's memory and violated the sacred traditions of imperial burial. He immediately ordered a massive manhunt, offering rewards for the capture of escaped burial victims and punishments for anyone who helped them hide. It was like issuing wanted posters for people whose only crime was not wanting to be buried alive. The search efforts revealed just how extensive the escape network had become. Investigators discovered hidden supply caches, detailed maps of escape routes, and evidence of coordination between different groups of intended victims. They found coded messages hidden in musical compositions, secret meeting places in the tomb complex, and even evidence that some palace guards had been providing weapons to potential burial victims. The conspiracy had been far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Local communities faced their own dilemmas as escaped burial victims sought shelter. Helping escaped imperial burial victims was technically treason, but many common people sympathized with individuals who were simply trying to avoid being murdered for someone else's funeral. Some villages quietly absorbed escaped craftsmen who offered their skills in exchange for protection. Others turned in escapees to collect the rewards, leading to a kind of rural manhunt that divided communities. The international reaction was swift and embarrassing. Foreign ambassadors who had arrived for the emperor's funeral witnessed the chaos of missing burial victims, postponed ceremonies, and massive search operations. Reports of the escape attempt spread throughout Asia, creating diplomatic problems for the already unstable Qin dynasty. Some foreign powers used the incident as evidence that Chinese imperial authority was weakening, while others expressed quiet admiration for the escapees' ingenuity. Religious communities were divided in their response. Some Buddhist and Taoist leaders quietly celebrated the escape as a victory for the sanctity of life, while others worried about the precedent of defying imperial authority. A few brave religious leaders actually provided sanctuary for escaped burial victims, arguing that protecting innocent life took precedence over political obligations. This created additional tensions between religious and secular authorities. The economic consequences were significant. The escape of skilled craftsmen meant that many ongoing imperial projects lost their most experienced workers. The tomb complex itself was left unfinished in some areas because the engineers who understood its design had escaped. Palace operations were disrupted because experienced servants and guards were missing. It was like having your entire senior staff quit simultaneously, except they had quit to avoid being murdered. Perhaps most importantly, the escape attempt created a new model for resistance to live burial that would influence future cases. Word of the successful escape spread throughout China, inspiring others who faced similar situations. The techniques used by Qin Wei and his conspirators became legendary, and their story was quietly passed down through generations of craftsmen, servants, and palace workers. It proved that even the most systematic oppression could be resisted, with careful planning and coordinated action. The second emperor's response was to make live burial procedures even more strict and surveillance even more intensive. But the psychological damage was done. The myth of inevitable compliance with burial orders had been shattered, and future emperors would have to deal with the knowledge that their eternal companions might not be as willing as they appeared. This escape attempt wasn't just a dramatic, historical footnote. It represented a fundamental challenge to the entire philosophical foundation of imperial live burial. The successful resistance demonstrated that the practice depended not just on imperial authority, but on the compliance of the victims, and that compliance couldn't be assumed even under the most extreme circumstances. The incident revealed the inherent contradictions in a system that depended on skilled, intelligent people to implement practices designed to kill those same skilled, intelligent people. The very qualities that made craftsmen, guards, and officials valuable for burial also made them capable of resistance. It was like designing a prison system and then hiring the inmates to build and run it. Eventually, they were going to notice the fundamental problems with the arrangement. The escape also highlighted the economic irrationality of live burial practices. The Qin dynasty lost some of its most valuable human resources not to the burial itself, but to the escape attempts it prompted. The time and effort spent tracking down escaped burial victims could have been used for productive activities. The disruption to ongoing projects caused by missing craftsmen created costs that far exceeded any symbolic benefits of proper imperial burial. Most significantly, the incident demonstrated that live burial was not an inevitable consequence of imperial power, but a choice that could be resisted. This realization would influence how future dynasties approached the practice, leading to modifications, reforms, and eventually abandonment of the most extreme forms of live burial. The escaped craftsmen of 210 BCE had essentially proved that systematic murder was neither necessary nor sustainable as a form of imperial tradition. The precedent of successful resistance also created a new form of social contract between rulers and their subjects. Future emperors would have to consider whether their burial preferences were worth the risk of rebellion, escape attempts, and loss of skilled personnel. The absolute authority that had previously made live burial possible was revealed to have practical limits that even divine emperors couldn't ignore. What emerged from this crisis was the beginning of a new understanding that imperial power, no matter how absolute in theory, was still constrained by practical realities, including the inconvenient fact that people generally preferred not to be buried alive, and were sometimes willing to do something about it. Around the main drama of emperors and their involuntary eternal companions, a fascinating cast of supporting characters emerged, who had to navigate the complex world of live burial from the sidelines. These were the people who weren't important enough to get buried alive, but were involved enough to have their lives completely disrupted by the practice. Think of them as the supporting cast in history's most morbid theatrical production. Minister Wei Yang, the chief burial coordinator during the late Qin dynasty, was essentially the world's first professional funeral director specializing in mass murder. His job description would have been fascinating to read. Seeking experienced administrator for large-scale burial projects. Must have excellent organizational skills, attention to detail, and absolutely no moral qualms about burying hundreds of people alive. Previous experience with logistics, crowd control, and ignoring screaming preferred, but not required. Wei Yang developed what he called the Manual of Eternal Service Procedures, a 300-page bureaucratic masterpiece that covered everything from victim selection criteria to proper tomb sealing techniques. Wei Yang's personal letters, preserved in family archives, reveal a man struggling with what we might generously call workplace stress. "Today I processed the burial list for the Emperor's musician corps," he wrote to his brother. 27 talented artists who will never see another sunrise because His Imperial Majesty enjoys a good flute solo. "I sometimes wonder if I should have become a farmer, like Father suggested. Farmers plant things in the ground to help them grow, not to make them stop breathing." Despite his obvious discomfort, Wei Yang continued in his position for over a decade, becoming arguably the most efficient mass murderer in administrative history. Lady Shen Mei represented a different kind of supporting character: the families left behind by live burial victims. Her husband, master craftsman Liu Wei, was selected for burial with Emperor Wu of Han in 87 BCE, leaving Chen Mei to raise 3 children alone while dealing with the social stigma of being married to someone who had been honored with eternal service. The government provided a modest pension to burial victims' families, essentially paying them for the privilege of murdering their loved ones, which Chen Mei described as grief money that tastes like poison. Chen Mei's survival strategies became legendary among other burial widows. She established an informal network of women whose husbands had been buried alive, creating what amounted to history's first support group for involuntary widowhood. These women shared resources, helped raise each other's children, and maintained their sanity by developing an impressively dark sense of humor about their situation. "My husband got the ultimate job security," Chen Mei would joke bitterly. No layoffs, no early retirement, and definitely no office politics. Of course, the benefits package left something to be desired. Foreign Ambassador Marcus Aurelius Trajanus from the Roman Empire visited the Chinese court in 97 CE and left detailed records of his observations that read like the ancient equivalent of a travel blog written by someone who wandered into a horror movie by mistake. "The Chinese approach to funeral arrangements," he wrote, "makes our gladiatorial games look like children's birthday parties. At least our condemned criminals get to fight for their lives. Here they just dress people up nicely and bury them with full honors while they're still breathing. It's remarkably civilized and completely insane at the same time." Trajanus became an unwitting expert on Chinese burial practices during his extended diplomatic mission. His letters home describe elaborate ceremonies where hundreds of people, dressed in fine silk robes, processed solemnly into tombs from which they would never emerge, while musicians played beautiful sad songs that became increasingly ironic as the tomb entrances were sealed. He noted that Chinese officials treated these events as normal administrative functions, discussing burial logistics with the same casual efficiency that Romans might use to plan a tax collection. Perhaps most fascinating was Dr. Jiang Heng, the court physician who was responsible for determining when emperors were actually dead and burial ceremonies could begin. This was a job that came with enormous pressure, since declaring an emperor dead too early meant starting the burial process prematurely, while waiting too long meant dealing with decomposition issues that would complicate the ceremony. Jiang Heng developed elaborate tests for confirming death, partly from medical necessity and partly because he understood that his diagnosis would trigger hundreds of other deaths. Jiang Heng's medical journals reveal a man caught between scientific rigor and political necessity. "Today, I confirmed the death of His Imperial Majesty after conducting all established tests," he wrote. "His breathing has ceased, his pulse is absent, and his body shows no response to stimulation. I have waited the traditional 3 days to ensure no possibility of error. In 6 hours, 400 people will follow him into the tomb. I sometimes wonder if my medical training prepared me for this responsibility. They taught me to preserve life, not to determine when it was appropriate to end hundreds of others." These weren't isolated incidents involving separate groups of people. The practice of live burial created complex webs of relationships, dependencies, and unintended consequences that connected seemingly unrelated individuals across Chinese society. It was like a massive, morbid social network where everyone was connected by degrees of separation from potential burial victims. Consider the relationship between master architect Li Ming and tea merchant Wang Shu, who lived in completely different social circles, but whose lives became intertwined through the burial system. Li Ming was commissioned to design Emperor Xuanzong's tomb complex in 712 CE, a project that would take 8 years and ultimately cost him his life when he was buried with the emperor to protect the tomb's secrets. Wang Shu was a common merchant who supplied tea to the palace, including special ceremonial blends used in burial preparations. The connection between these two men emerged when Li Ming, knowing his fate, began secretly commissioning Wang Shu to deliver messages to his family. Using tea deliveries as cover, Wang Shu became an unofficial postal service for condemned burial victims, carrying final letters, family instructions, and sometimes small valuables to relatives who would never see their loved ones again. Wang Shu's tea shop became an informal meeting place for burial victims' families, who would gather to share news and support each other through their shared tragedy. The relationship became even more complex when Wang Shu's own son, apprentice, carpenter Chen Lu, joined Li Ming's construction crew. Suddenly, the tea merchant found himself in the impossible position of enabling communication for burial victims, while his own child was working on the project that would likely lead to his death. Wang Shu began secretly teaching his son escape techniques disguised as delivery routes, essentially using his knowledge of palace logistics to help his child avoid the fate of his customers. This web of relationships extended throughout the palace. Hierarchy. Palace guards who were responsible for preventing escape attempts often had family members who worked as servants and might be selected for burial. Court officials who organized burial ceremonies had children who worked as craftsmen on tomb projects. Kitchen staff who prepared ceremonial burial feasts had relatives among the concubines who might be buried. Everyone was simultaneously part of the system and potentially threatened by it. The economic networks were equally intertwined. Silk merchants who provided burial robes also supplied cloth for escape disguises. Weaponsmiths who created ceremonial burial items also secretly forged tools for tunnel digging. Food suppliers who catered burial ceremonies also stockpiled provisions for escape attempts. The same commercial networks that supported the burial system also enabled resistance to it, creating a kind of parallel economy based on survival rather than ceremony. Marriage patterns were particularly affected by these interconnections. Families began arranging marriages specifically to create political protection for potential burial victims. A skilled craftsman might marry the daughter of a powerful court official, calculating that his in-laws would be too influential to allow his burial. Concubines sought relationships with guards who might help them escape. Court officials married into merchant families who could provide safe houses and escape routes. These strategic marriages created their own complications. Love matches became political calculations. Family loyalties were tested when relatives found themselves on opposite sides of burial decisions. Children grew up understanding that their parents' marriage arrangements might determine whether they lived or died. It was like a massive, multi-generational chess game where everyone was trying to avoid being sacrificed for someone else's strategy. Religious communities provided another layer of interconnection. Buddhist temples that officially opposed live. Burial secretly provided sanctuary for escaped victims. Taoist monasteries that publicly supported imperial traditions privately maintained escape networks. Confucian scholars who wrote philosophical justifications for burial practices also wrote coded warnings about upcoming ceremonies. Religious festivals became opportunities for covert communication between families of burial victims. The temple Networks were particularly sophisticated. Monks developed elaborate systems for hiding escaped burial victims, often disguising them as religious pilgrims or new converts. Temple kitchens fed fugitive craftsmen. Temple libraries hid family correspondence. And temple grounds provided meeting places for resistance planning. Some monasteries became essentially underground railroads for people trying to avoid eternal employment, complete with safe houses, supply caches, and transportation networks thought to understand how live burial became so deeply embedded in Chinese culture. You have to understand the broader social context that made systematic murder seem like reasonable public policy. Daily life in ancient China was structured around hierarchies so rigid that they made modern corporate org charts look anarchistic. Everyone had a specific place in society, specific duties to fulfill, and specific expectations about how they would live, work, and die. The concept of individual choice, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist for most people. Your career was often determined by your family's traditional occupation. Your marriage was arranged by your parents. Your place of residence was dictated by your job assignment. Your religious practices were regulated by the state. In this context, having your death scheduled by imperial decree was just another aspect of a life where personal autonomy was essentially non-existent. Social mobility was theoretically possible through the imperial examination system, but in practice, most people were born into their social class and stayed there. This created a culture where accepting your fate, even when that fate was horrible, was considered a virtue. Resistance to authority was seen as socially disruptive and morally wrong. Complaining about your circumstances was viewed as ungrateful and potentially treasonous. The religious context made live burial even more acceptable to the general population. Confucian philosophy emphasized duty to authority figures, including absolute duty to the emperor. Taoist beliefs about harmony with natural order suggested that fighting against your assigned role in society was spiritually harmful. Buddhist concepts of karma implied that burial victims had somehow earned their fate through actions in previous lives. Family honor was paramount in ways that modern individualistic societies find difficult to understand. Being selected for burial with an emperor was officially considered an honor that reflected well on your entire family line. Refusing this honor would bring shame not just to you, but to your parents, children, and future descendants. Some families actually volunteered their members for burial service to gain social status, essentially trading their children's lives for political advancement. The economic structure reinforced these cultural patterns. Most skilled craftsmen depended entirely on imperial patronage for their livelihood. Refusing royal commissions meant economic ruin, while accepting them meant eventual death. There was no middle ground, no alternative economy, no way to opt out of the system that they would ultimately consume you. It was like being trapped in a subscription service where a cancellation wasn't allowed, and the final payment was your life. Daily customs reinforced the acceptability of live burial through countless small rituals and traditions. Children grew up hearing stories that portrayed burial victims as heroes and models of proper behavior. Festivals celebrated the loyalty of servants who followed their masters into death. Poetry and music praised the devotion of concubines who chose eternal service over lonely widowhood. The entire cultural apparatus worked to normalize what should have been recognized as systematic murder. Perhaps most ironic was how the practice of live burial created exactly the problems it was designed to solve. The system was supposed to ensure loyalty and prevent the disclosure of imperial secrets, but it actually encouraged disloyalty and created elaborate networks for sharing forbidden information. The prospect of being buried alive motivated people to develop escape plans, communication systems, and resistance networks that were far more sophisticated than anything they would have created Under normal circumstances, the economic contradictions were equally absurd. The Chinese economy depended on skilled craftsmen, experienced administrators, and trained military personnel. Yet the burial system systematically destroyed these same human resources. It was like deliberately burning down your factories to ensure they couldn't be stolen by competitors. Technically effective, but ultimately self-defeating. The religious contradictions created theological contortions that would have impressed medieval scholastic philosophers. The same religious traditions that emphasized the sanctity of life and compassion for all beings were used to justify mass murder for funeral purposes. Buddhist monks who had taken vows to harm no living creature presided over ceremonies where hundreds of people were buried alive. Confucian scholars who preached about benevolent government wrote detailed justifications for systematic killing of innocent people. The social contradictions were perhaps most revealing. A culture that prized order, stability, and predictability created a system that randomly selected productive citizens for death, disrupted families without warning, and made long-term planning impossible for anyone in certain occupations. The very values that supposedly justified live burial were undermined by its practice. Most absurdly, the burial system was supposed to honor the dead by providing them with eternal companions, but the companions were often unwilling, resentful, and actively plotting against their eternal service. Instead of creating harmonious afterlife households, the practice filled tombs with people who had every reason to be angry about their situation. If the afterlife was real, it was probably populated with extremely annoyed servants, bitter concubines, and craftsmen who spent eternity complaining about their working conditions. The medical contradictions were darkly comic. Palace physicians, who had sworn to preserve life, were required to determine when death had occurred so that more deaths could be scheduled. Court officials who prided themselves on administrative efficiency organized events that deliberately wasted human resources. Military commanders who understood the value of trained personnel participated in their systematic destruction. Everyone involved understood that the system was counterproductive, but everyone continued participating because changing it was more dangerous than maintaining it. Everything changed when Emperor Zhao of Han decided in 87 BCE that burying skilled craftsmen alive was perhaps not the most economically sound policy for a growing empire. This wasn't a sudden moral awakening or a philosophical breakthrough about human rights. It was basically an ancient Chinese version of cost-benefit analysis that happened to save thousands of lives as a side effect. Sometimes the best social progress comes from people doing math instead of trying to be noble. The turning point came when Emperor Zhao's economic advisors presented him with what amounted to the world's first spreadsheet analysis of live burial costs. They calculated that the skilled workers buried with previous emperors represented roughly 50,000 man-years of training and experience that had been permanently removed from the economy. To put this in perspective, they had literally buried the equivalent of a major university's entire faculty, staff, and student body just to keep dead emperors company. The advisors, led by the remarkably practical Minister of Works, Lu Bod, pointed out that replacing these skilled workers required massive training programs, imported expertise, and years of reduced productivity. Your Majesty, Lu Bod reportedly said, "We are essentially eating our own economy one funeral at a time. If we continue this practice, we will eventually run out of people who know how to build the tombs we bury people in, creating what philosophers might call an existential paradox, but what economists definitely call a stupid business plan." What made this moment different from previous critiques of live burial was that it came from within the imperial administration, not from outside moral critics or foreign observers. The people who actually organized the burials were finally admitting that the system was fundamentally broken. It was like having your funeral director suggest that maybe you didn't need quite so many people buried with you, especially if you wanted to have any living people left to organize your next funeral. The emperor's response was surprisingly pragmatic. Instead of defending tradition or appealing to religious necessity, he asked his advisors to propose alternatives that would maintain the symbolic importance of burial companions while preserving the empire's human capital. This was revolutionary thinking. The idea that imperial traditions could be modified based on practical considerations rather than maintained regardless of their consequences. The psychological breakthrough was equally important. For the first time, an emperor publicly acknowledged that the economic and social costs of live burial might outweigh its symbolic benefits. This admission created space for court officials to discuss reforms without being accused of treason or disrespect for imperial traditions. Suddenly, criticizing live burial became a legitimate policy position rather than a potentially fatal act of rebellion. The international context also supported change. Chinese diplomats reported that live burial practices were damaging the empire's reputation with trading partners and potential allies. Foreign merchants were reluctant to do business with a culture that systematically murdered its own skilled workers. Military allies questioned the strategic wisdom of an empire that deliberately weakened itself through funeral arrangements. The emperor was beginning to understand that live burial wasn't just an internal policy issue. It was a foreign relations problem that affected China's position in the broader world. The transformation didn't happen overnight, partly because changing a centuries-old practice of systematic murder required considerable bureaucratic finesse, and partly because nobody wanted to be the person who suggested to a dying emperor that maybe he didn't need quite so many eternal companions. The reform process became a masterclass in political maneuvering, where saving lives required the same diplomatic skills usually reserved for starting wars. The first major innovation was the introduction of what officials euphemistically called substitute companions, essentially high-quality clay figures that could represent living people in burial ceremonies. The craftsmen who created these figures approached their work with the enthusiasm of people who understood that making good fake burial victims meant fewer real burial victims would be needed. It was probably the only time in history when artists were literally sculpting people out of mortal danger. Master sculptor Wang Meng became the unlikely hero of burial reform when his clay figures became so lifelike that Emperor Zhao declared them adequate for imperial service. Wang Meng's workshop became a kind of life-saving production facility, turning out hundreds of clay soldiers, servants, and entertainers that could fulfill burial requirements without actually killing anyone. His sales pitch was probably unique. In the history of art, why bury real people when you can bury fake people who won't complain about working conditions in the afterlife? The resistance to change came from predictable sources. Court officials who had built their careers around organizing live burials suddenly found their expertise becoming obsolete. Religious leaders who had developed elaborate theological justifications for the practice discovered that their carefully constructed arguments were being undermined by practical alternatives. Traditional families who had gained social status by volunteering relatives for burial service worried that their sacrifices would be devalued if live burial became optional. Military commanders presented particularly strong opposition, arguing that replacing real guards with clay figures would leave the emperor defenseless in the afterlife. General Li Guangli famously declared that clay soldiers cannot fight spiritual battles, which prompted Minister Liu Bo to respond that dead soldiers cannot fight any battles at all, spiritual or otherwise. This exchange became legendary in court circles as an example of how practical thinking could overcome traditional military logic. The economic arguments gradually won over most skeptics. Court accountants calculated that a single skilled craftsman represented an investment of approximately 10 years of training and experience. Burying 100 craftsmen was equivalent to destroying 1,000 man-years of economic productivity. Even the most tradition-minded officials had difficulty arguing that symbolic benefits justified such massive economic waste, especially when clay alternatives could provide the same symbolic function. The implementation process required remarkable diplomatic creativity. Rather than suddenly announcing the end of live burial, court officials gradually introduced alternatives as additional options for imperial burials. Clay figures were initially presented as supplements to human burial. Victims, not replacements. This allowed traditionalists to maintain their practices while reformers experimented with alternatives. The breakthrough came when Emperor Jia's actual burial in 74 BCE included both clay figures and significantly fewer human victims than previous. Imperial funerals. The emperor was buried with only 12 human companions, all volunteers from his personal guard, who specifically requested the honor, compared to the hundreds or thousands who had been buried with previous emperors. The ceremony was declared a complete success, proving that meaningful imperial burial could be achieved without mass murder. Foreign observers noted the change immediately. Roman ambassador Lucius Cornelius wrote, "The Chinese funeral included beautiful processions, elaborate ceremonies, and magnificent grave goods, but significantly fewer screening people being buried alive." This represents a marked improvement in both the aesthetic and humanitarian aspects of imperial death management. The ripple effects extended throughout Chinese society. Craftsmen began accepting imperial commissions without expecting them to be death sentences. Palace servants stopped treating royal employment as essentially terminal career moves. Musicians and entertainers could perform for emperors without wondering if their talent would doom them to eternal service. The psychological relief was enormous. Suddenly, being good at your job was no longer potentially fatal. The technical innovations that emerged from burial reform were remarkable. Artisans developed new techniques for creating lifelike clay figures, leading to advances in sculpture and ceramics that influenced Chinese art for centuries. Engineers designed elaborate mechanical devices for tombs, creating the ancient equivalent of special effects for burial ceremonies. The same creative energy that had once been devoted to efficient mass murder was redirected toward artistic and technological innovation. The most significant change was cultural. The emperor had demonstrated that imperial traditions could be modified based on practical considerations without compromising imperial dignity or spiritual efficacy. This precedent would influence Chinese governmental thinking for generations, establishing the principle that even the most sacred traditions should be subject to rational evaluation. The new burial system that emerged was simultaneously more humane and more elaborate than what it replaced. Instead of burying hundreds of real people, emperors were now buried with thousands of clay figures, elaborate mechanical devices, and artistic treasures that required far more skill and creativity to produce than simple mass murder. It was like trading quantity murder for quality art, which was definitely an improvement from multiple perspectives. The reform burial practices created entirely new industries. Clay figure production became a major economic sector, employing thousands of artists, sculptors, and craftsmen who specialized in creating lifelike burial companions. These weren't simple pottery figures. They were elaborate works of art with individual faces, detailed clothing, and specialized equipment. Each figure represented hours of skilled labor, making imperial burials more expensive, but far less deadly. The economic benefits were immediate and substantial. Skilled craftsmen who previously expected to die upon completing major projects could now plan long careers with multiple commissions. Palace employment became a desirable career path rather than a delayed death sentence. The retention of institutional knowledge led to rapid improvements in construction techniques, artistic methods, and administrative systems. It turned out that not killing your most talented workers was remarkably good for productivity. The social changes were equally dramatic. Families no longer lived with the constant fear that their relatives' skills might doom them to burial service. Marriage patterns shifted as people could form relationships based on personal preference rather than strategic calculations about burial protection. Children could follow their talents and interests without worrying that excellence in certain fields might prove fatal. The new system also created different types of status competition. Instead of families gaining honor by sacrificing members for burial service, they now competed to commission the most impressive clay burial figures. Wealthy families hired the best artists to create elaborate ceramic representations of their relatives, who might have been buried in the old system. It was like a combination of portrait painting and life insurance. You got commemorated in clay instead of dying in reality. Palace dynamics changed completely. Court officials could focus on governance rather than spending half their time organizing mass murder. Military commanders could concentrate on external threats instead of worrying about whether their expertise would doom them to burial duty. Musicians and entertainers could develop long-term relationships with imperial patrons without expecting those relationships to end abruptly and permanently. The international reputation benefits were substantial. Foreign diplomats noted the changes approvingly, leading to improved trade relationships and military alliances. Chinese cultural products, art, literature, philosophy, began to be viewed more favorably by other civilizations that had been disturbed by the systematic live burial practices. It was like finally getting invited to international dinner parties after years of being known as the people who buried their friends alive. Religious communities adapted to the new reality with remarkable speed. Buddhist and Taoist leaders who had struggled to reconcile their beliefs with live burial practices enthusiastically endorsed the clay figure alternatives. Confucian scholars developed new philosophical frameworks that emphasized the superior virtue of preserving life while maintaining proper burial honors. Religious festivals that had previously included prayers for burial victims were modified to celebrate the wisdom of merciful emperors. The artistic renaissance that followed burial reform was extraordinary. The same creative energy that had once been devoted to efficient killing was redirected toward innovative sculpture, elaborate tomb design, and sophisticated mechanical engineering. Chinese burial art became increasingly sophisticated, creating some of the most impressive archaeological sites in human history, but filled with clay figures instead of human remains. Most importantly, the new system proved that fundamental social changes were possible even in rigidly traditional societies, as long as the changes could be framed as improvements rather than revolutions. Was this change actually an improvement? From almost every measurable perspective, the answer was overwhelmingly yes. Though, as with most social reforms in ancient China, the benefits were distributed unevenly and the motivations were mixed at best. The burial reforms represented genuine progress achieved for somewhat cynical reasons, which was probably the most Chinese way possible to accidentally become more humane. The economic benefits were undeniable. The imperial workshops that had once produced burial preparations for human victims were now creating sophisticated art and technology. The skilled workers who would have been buried alive were instead training apprentices, developing new techniques, and contributing to economic growth. The cost-benefit analysis that originally motivated the reforms proved remarkably accurate. Preserving human capital led to increased productivity and innovation that far exceeded the economic value of traditional burial practices. From a humanitarian perspective, the reforms obviously saved thousands of lives, though this was treated more as a pleasant side effect than as the primary goal. Chinese court records from this period discuss the preservation of skilled workers in purely economic terms. with very little philosophical reflection on the moral implications of not murdering people for funeral purposes. The saving of lives was treated as a practical benefit rather than an ethical imperative, which probably tells us something important about ancient Chinese priorities. The international reputation benefits exceeded expectations. Trade relationships improved. Diplomatic negotiations became easier, and Chinese cultural products found more receptive audiences in foreign markets. The burial reforms enhanced China's soft power in ways that military conquest couldn't achieve, proving that appearing less barbaric to your neighbors had measurable strategic advantages. Short-term effects included immediate improvements in palace morale, increased artistic innovation, and more stable economic planning. Long-term effects included the gradual development of more humane governmental practices, increased emphasis on practical policy evaluation, and the establishment of precedents for reforming traditional practices based on rational analysis. Different perspectives on the reforms vary predictably by social position. Court officials appreciated the reduced administrative complexity of organizing fewer mass murders. Craftsmen and servants were obviously enthusiastic about their improved life expectancy. Traditional religious leaders were more ambivalent, losing some of their ceremonial importance while gaining moral consistency. Foreign observers were universally positive, finally able to discuss Chinese civilization without having to awkwardly explain the systematic burial of living people. The unintended consequences were mostly positive, including artistic innovations, economic growth, and improved international relations, a rare example of political reform that actually worked better than anyone expected. Probably because the expectations were so low to begin with that in the years and decades that followed Emperor Zhao's burial reforms, Chinese society discovered that not systematically murdering skilled workers had all sorts of unexpected benefits that nobody had really thought to consider beforehand. It was like finally removing a massive weight that everyone had gotten so used to carrying that they'd forgotten how much easier life could be without it. The improvements cascaded through Chinese civilization in ways that probably surprised even the reform's original supporters. The most immediate change was what historians now call the Great Retention. Skilled craftsmen, artists, and administrators who would previously have been buried alive began accumulating decades of experience. Instead of being efficiently disposed of after major projects, master architects who survived their first imperial commission could apply their knowledge to second and third projects, leading to increasingly sophisticated construction techniques. Musicians who lived past their first imperial performance could develop new forms of entertainment and train multiple generations of students. This accumulation of expertise created an unexpected phenomenon: institutional memory. For the first time in centuries, Chinese workshops and administrative offices could build on previous knowledge, rather than constantly starting over with new personnel. The learning curve for complex projects shortened dramatically as experienced workers could train newcomers instead of taking their knowledge to early graves. It was like finally allowing your organizations to learn from their mistakes instead of burying the evidence. The economic ripple effects were remarkable. Industries that had previously suffered from chronic talent shortage, architecture, engineering, metallurgy, fine arts, suddenly found themselves with stable workforces that could take on increasingly ambitious projects. The famous Tang Dynasty engineering projects, including the Grand Canal expansions and the elaborate palace complexes, were only possible because China finally had engineers who lived long enough to learn from their previous work. Palace employment patterns changed completely. Instead of treating royal service as essentially a death sentence with good benefits, skilled workers began competing for imperial commissions that could lead to long, prestigious careers. The quality of work improved dramatically as craftsmen could afford to invest time in developing their skills, rather than rushing to complete projects before their inevitable burial. Court musicians developed increasingly sophisticated compositions. Knowing they might live to hear them performed multiple times, new challenges emerged that nobody had anticipated. With skilled workers actually surviving their projects, China suddenly had aging craftsmen who needed retirement plans, healthcare, and pension systems. The imperial administration had to develop entirely new bureaucratic structures to manage long-term employment relationships instead of just scheduling efficient executions. It was like transitioning from a temporary staffing agency to a permanent human resources department, which required completely different organizational skills. The international implications were equally significant. Foreign powers that had previously viewed Chinese engineering and artistic achievements with a mixture of admiration and horror could now engage with Chinese culture without the moral complications of supporting a civilization that regularly buried its most talented citizens alive. Trade relationships deepened as foreign merchants felt more comfortable working with Chinese artisans who would probably still be alive for future business dealings. Religious communities experienced their own transformations. Temples that had previously struggled to reconcile their theological beliefs with the realities of imperial burial practices could now focus on spiritual development without constantly having to explain why their compassionate philosophy somehow justified systematic murder. Buddhist and Taoist monasteries became centers of learning and artistic development instead of refuges for people trying to avoid burial duty. The reformed burial system created space for entirely new types of people to emerge as important figures in Chinese society. These were individuals whose roles and contributions would have been impossible under the old system of systematic live burial, representing a kind of social evolution that nobody had planned but everyone benefited from. Master clay artist Qin Shi became perhaps the most influential artist of the early Han period, specializing in creating burial figures so lifelike that they essentially replaced the need for human burial companions. Qin Shi's workshop employed over 200 artists and craftsmen who developed new techniques for creating detailed facial expressions, realistic clothing, and even individual personalities for clay figures. His work was so convincing that some court officials reportedly preferred clay servants to real ones, since the clay versions never complained about working conditions or asked for time. Qin Shi's innovations went far beyond simple sculpture. He developed modular clay figure systems, where individual body parts could be mass-produced and then assembled into custom burial companions. He created specialized figures for different occupations. Clay musicians with movable fingers for realistic instrument playing, clay soldiers with interchangeable weapons and armor, even clay concubines with elaborate silk clothing and jewelry. His workshop became essentially a factory for artificial people, which was probably the world's first example of industrial-scale humanoid manufacturing. The success of Qin Shi's business model inspired an entire industry of burial alternative specialists. Master engineer Liu Feng developed mechanical burial companions, elaborate clockwork figures that could perform simple movements and sounds when activated by tomb mechanisms. These mechanical servants could pour wine for the deceased emperor through ingenious pulley systems, play music through wind-activated instruments, and even stand guard through weight-activated movement systems. It was like creating the world's first robots, except they were designed specifically for dead people. Entrepreneur Wang Li recognized that the new burial system created opportunities for what we might now call death services consulting. Her business helped wealthy families plan elaborate clay burial arrangements that demonstrated their devotion to deceased relatives, without actually killing any living relatives. Wang Li's consultations included artistic design, symbolic representation, and cost-benefit analysis of different burial options. She essentially invented the funeral planning industry, except with a much heavier emphasis on keeping the participants alive. Court Administrator Jiang Wei emerged as a new type of bureaucratic specialist, the imperial burial efficiency expert. His job was to maximize the symbolic impact of burial ceremonies while minimizing their human cost. Jiang Wei developed elaborate protocols for determining the optimal ratio of clay figures to living participants, ensuring that imperial burials maintained their spiritual effectiveness while preserving valuable human resources. He was like a management consultant specializing in death logistics, which was probably a unique career path even by ancient Chinese standards. Religious leader Master Li Dao represented a new generation of spiritual advisors who could provide theological guidance for burial practices without having to justify mass murder. Li Dao developed Buddhist interpretations of clay figure burial that emphasized compassion for all living beings while maintaining proper respect for the deceased. His writings became influential throughout China, providing religious justification for humane burial practices that previous generations of monks had struggled to develop. Foreign advisor Marcus Antonius, a Roman engineer who settled in China during this period, brought international perspectives to Chinese burial practices that helped accelerate the reform process. Antonius documented Chinese burial innovations and compared them favorably to Roman practices, providing external validation for the Chinese reforms. His writings helped establish China's reputation as a civilization that had successfully modernized its death management without sacrificing cultural authenticity. These new players differed from earlier figures primarily in their assumption that skilled work should lead to long careers rather than early deaths, and their focus on innovation rather than tradition. But some problems persisted despite the burial reforms, proving that even successful social changes couldn't solve all the underlying issues that had made live burial possible in the first place. The fundamental power imbalances, social hierarchies, and cultural attitudes that had supported systematic murder weren't eliminated by substituting clay figures for real people. They were just redirected into less lethal, but still problematic channels. Regional resistance to burial reform remained strong in certain areas of China, particularly in remote provinces where traditional practices were more deeply entrenched and central government oversight was limited. Local nobles and regional governors sometimes continued practicing live burial despite imperial edicts, arguing that their particular circumstances required traditional approaches. It was like having federal legislation that was selectively ignored by local authorities who preferred their own interpretation of proper funeral etiquette. The northern provinces, with their emphasis on military tradition, were particularly resistant to change. Regional commanders argued that clay soldiers couldn't provide real protection for deceased leaders and that substituting fake warriors for real ones demonstrated weakness that would encourage enemy attacks. Some military funeral ceremonies continued to include live burial of guards and advisors well into the later Han period, creating an ongoing enforcement challenge for imperial administrators. Economic inequality created new versions of old problems. While imperial burials increasingly used clay figures instead of human victims, wealthy private citizens sometimes continued practicing live burial as a way of demonstrating their superior status and traditional values. It became a kind of luxury good, being rich enough to bury real people alive instead of settling for mere clay substitutes. The black market for live burial services persisted in some areas, creating an underground economy that catered to traditionalist families with more money than moral sense. The quality control issues with clay figure production created their own complications. Not all burial alternative craftsmen maintained the artistic standards established by pioneers like Chen Zhu. leading to imperial burials that included poorly made clay figures that were obviously fake. Some emperors complained that being buried with cheap clay knockoffs was undignified, while others worried that low-quality burial companions might be ineffective in the afterlife. It was the ancient equivalent of counterfeit luxury goods, except the consequences involved eternal spiritual well-being instead of just social embarrassment. Religious communities struggled with new theological questions that emerged from burial reform. If clay figures could serve as effective burial companions, what did this mean about the nature of spiritual service in the afterlife? Were mechanical burial devices somehow spiritually inferior to human companions? Different Buddhist and Taoist schools developed contradictory interpretations, leading to sectarian disputes about proper burial theology that sometimes became as contentious as the original debates about live burial. The international implications created their own ongoing challenges. While most foreign powers approved of Chinese burial reforms, some neighboring kingdoms used China's abandonment of traditional practices as evidence of moral decline and spiritual weakness. Diplomatic negotiations sometimes included discussions of burial practices, with some foreign leaders questioning whether Chinese emperors buried with clay figures could maintain proper spiritual authority. It was like having your foreign policy complicated by your funeral arrangements, which was probably a uniquely Chinese diplomatic challenge. Enforcement mechanisms for burial reform remained problematic throughout the later Han period and beyond. While imperial edicts prohibited most forms of live burial, monitoring compliance across the vast Chinese empire was practically impossible. Local officials sometimes ignored or selectively enforced burial regulations, particularly when dealing with powerful families who preferred traditional practices. The same administrative challenges that had made other imperial policies difficult to enforce also complicated efforts to eliminate live burial entirely. Perhaps most significantly, the underlying cultural attitudes that had made live burial acceptable. The devaluation of individual life. The assumption that social inferiors existed primarily to serve social superiors. The belief that tradition justified almost any practice persisted even after the practice itself was reformed. Compared to earlier periods of Chinese history, the post-reform era represented a remarkable transformation in the relationship between imperial power and individual survival, though the changes were more pragmatic than philosophical. Earlier dynasties had treated human life as essentially disposable when it conflicted with imperial preferences or traditional practices. The reformed system maintained imperial authority while acknowledging practical limits on how that authority could be exercised without undermining the empire's own interests. The efficiency improvements were dramatic compared to pre-reform periods. Earlier dynasties had regularly destroyed their own human capital through burial practices, creating cycles of skill shortage and reduced productivity that weakened the empire over time. The reformed system allowed China to accumulate expertise and institutional knowledge in ways that had been impossible when skilled workers were routinely executed for funeral purposes. It was like finally allowing your civilization to learn from experience instead of burying the evidence. Compared to other contemporary civilizations, Chinese burial reform represented a unique solution to the universal problem of balancing traditional practices with practical necessities. Roman funeral practices, while elaborate, had never included systematic live burial on the Chinese scale. Egyptian burial traditions emphasized preservation of individual rulers rather than mass accompaniment by living servants. Persian customs focused on fire burial that made live accompaniment physically impossible. China was essentially solving a problem that other civilizations had avoided creating in the first place. What was unique about the Chinese approach was the emphasis on maintaining symbolic authenticity while eliminating practical problems. Rather than abandoning burial companions entirely, Chinese reformers developed increasingly sophisticated alternatives that preserved the spiritual and social functions of traditional practices while eliminating their human costs. Other civilizations that face similar reform challenges typically chose between maintaining traditions and improving outcomes, while China managed to achieve both simultaneously. The lessons that could be learned from Chinese burial reform were significant for understanding how entrenched social practices could be changed without complete cultural revolution. The key insight was that reform succeeded when it could be framed as improvement rather than abandonment of traditional values. Chinese reformers didn't argue that live burial was morally wrong. They argued that clay burial was more economically sensible and equally spiritually effective. The patterns that repeated elsewhere in Chinese governance were equally important. The same practical, cost-benefit approach that drove burial reform influenced other policy areas throughout the Han period and beyond. Chinese administrators became increasingly willing to modify traditional practices when they could demonstrate measurable benefits, leading to innovations in taxation, military organization, and administrative structure that were based on rational analysis rather than pure tradition. Perhaps most significantly, Chinese burial reform demonstrated that even the most fundamental cultural practices could be changed through incremental modification rather than revolutionary transformation. The gradual substitution of clay figures for human victims allowed Chinese society to maintain cultural continuity while eliminating its most problematic elements. This approach became a model for later Chinese reforms, establishing a pattern of evolutionary rather than revolutionary social change that characterized Chinese governance for centuries. The ultimate lesson was that pragmatic solutions could achieve humanitarian outcomes even when humanitarian motivations were absent, proving that good results didn't always require good intentions. By the time of the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century CE, signs pointed to the complete end of live burial as even an occasional practice, though the transformation was so gradual that many people didn't realize they were witnessing the death of a tradition that had persisted for over a millennium. The final elimination of live burial wasn't announced with imperial edicts or dramatic policy changes. It simply faded away as Chinese society evolved beyond the need for systematic murder as a form of funeral planning. The most telling sign was that court officials stopped maintaining detailed protocols for live burial procedures. The elaborate manuals that had once covered every aspect of victim selection, preparation, and burial were quietly archived and never updated. New administrators entering the imperial bureaucracy weren't trained in live burial logistics, and existing officials gradually reassigned their burial expertise to other areas. It was like watching a profession become extinct through lack of demand, which was probably the most peaceful way for the systematic murder industry to disappear. Palace employment patterns revealed another crucial shift. Skilled craftsmen, musicians, and servants began planning long-term careers with multiple imperial commissions, confident that their expertise would lead to advancement rather than burial. Job descriptions for palace positions no longer included subtle warnings about potential burial obligations. Marriage announcements among court personnel stopped mentioning provisions for widowhood due to burial service. The entire social infrastructure that had supported live burial was quietly transforming into something completely different. Religious leaders were among the first to notice the change, probably because they had been struggling with the theological implications of live burial. For centuries, Buddhist and Taoist monasteries stopped receiving refugees seeking sanctuary from potential burial selection. Temple prayers no longer included requests for protection from burial duty. Religious festivals that had traditionally honored burial victims were gradually modified to celebrate other forms of devotion and sacrifice. What key players could see versus what they missed created interesting historical ironies. Court officials, who had spent their careers organizing live burials, could observe the practical benefits of clay figure alternatives, but often failed to recognize that they were witnessing the end of an era. Foreign diplomats noted the improvements in Chinese civilization, but didn't always understand the historical significance of what they were observing. Even the emperors who benefited from the changes sometimes failed to grasp that they were presiding over a fundamental transformation. In Chinese culture, the resistance to inevitable change came from predictable sources, though it was increasingly ineffective. Traditional families who had gained status through voluntary burial service found their social advantages evaporating as the practice disappeared. Regional nobles who continued local live burial practices discovered that their traditional behavior was now viewed as backward and barbaric by the imperial court. Religious conservatives who had developed elaborate theological justifications for live burial found their expertise becoming irrelevant as the entire theological question became moot. Perhaps most significantly, the economic arguments that had originally motivated burial reform became so obviously correct that even traditionalists struggled to defend live burial on practical grounds. The accumulated benefits of preserving skilled workers were clearly visible in improved infrastructure, artistic achievement, and administrative efficiency. China's growing prosperity made it increasingly difficult to argue for policies that deliberately destroyed human capital for symbolic purposes. The practice of live burial didn't end with a dramatic final ceremony or imperial proclamation. It simply stopped happening, like a bad habit that people gradually outgrew until one day they realized they hadn't thought about it in years. The last documented case of imperial live burial occurred during Emperor Xuanzang's funeral in 762 CE, and even that involved only 3 volunteers from his personal guard who specifically requested the honor, making it more of a symbolic gesture than a systematic practice. The final major players in the live burial system were remarkably ordinary people dealing with the behead's end of an extraordinary institution. Master Burial Coordinator Liu Zheng found himself managing Emperor Xuanzang's funeral arrangements with a staff that had shrunk from hundreds of burial specialists to a small team focused primarily on clay, figure placement, and mechanical tune device installation. Liu Zheng's final reports described the strange experience of organizing an imperial burial that emphasized artistic achievement and technological innovation rather than human sacrifice. The 3 volunteers who chose burial, Guard Captain Chun Lu, personal attendant Wang Mei, and court musician Zhou Yang, were motivated by personal devotion rather than social obligation or imperial command. Their letters to family members described their decision as a personal choice rather than a duty, marking a fundamental shift in how burial service was understood. They were buried with full honors, but their decision was treated as an individual act of devotion rather than a model for others to follow. Last attempts to preserve traditional burial practices came from regional nobles and conservative court officials who worried that abandoning live burial would somehow weaken imperial authority or spiritual efficacy. Duke Li Wei of Shandong petitioned the emperor to maintain at least token live burial for major imperial funerals, arguing that clay figures couldn't provide adequate spiritual protection for deceased rulers. His petition was politely declined, with court officials noting that previous emperors buried with clay companions had shown no evidence of spiritual vulnerability in the afterlife. The gradual decline was more common than dramatic endings. Most cases of live burial simply stopped being scheduled rather than being formally abolished. Palace administrators found themselves organizing funerals without automatically including human burial victims on their planning lists. Court officials discovered that they could design meaningful burial ceremonies without calculating how many people needed to die. The institutional machinery that had once efficiently produced mass murder was quietly retooled for other purposes. The symbolic endpoints varied by region and social level. Imperial live burial ended with Emperor Xuanzong's funeral in 762 CE. Noble live burial largely disappeared during the late Tang period, though occasional cases persisted in remote areas until the Song dynasty. Military live burial continued sporadically until the Yuan dynasty, usually involving small numbers of volunteers rather than systematic conscription. Regional variations meant that live burial didn't end everywhere simultaneously, but the practice gradually became so unusual that it attracted attention rather than acceptance. Some court historians marked the symbolic end of live burial with Emperor Dezong's funeral in 805 CE, which included elaborate clay armies, mechanical burial devices, and artistic treasures, but no human burial victims whatsoever. The ceremony was declared completely successful by court officials, foreign observers, and religious leaders, proving definitively that imperial burial could achieve all its spiritual and social goals without killing anyone. It was like a graduation ceremony for Chinese civilization, demonstrating mastery of funeral arrangements that honored tradition while embracing humanity. The administrative changes that accompanied the end of live burial were substantial. Entire government departments that had specialized in burial victim selection, preparation, and logistics were reassigned to other functions. The Ministry of Burial Affairs was merged with the Ministry of Public Works, focusing on tomb construction and artistic production rather than human resource management for the afterlife. Career paths that had once led inevitably to execution were transformed into opportunities for advancement and professional development. The last burial manuals were archived with notes explaining that they were now historical documents rather than operational guides. Court libraries maintained these materials for scholarly research, but new administrators were no longer required to study live burial procedures as part of their training. It was like keeping old textbooks that were no longer relevant to current practice, except these particular textbooks had described how to efficiently murder large numbers of people for ceremonial purposes. The elimination of live burial resulted from a combination of factors that made the practice simultaneously unnecessary, economically wasteful, and socially counterproductive. Though the Chinese characteristically focused on the practical problems rather than dwelling on the moral issues. The end came not because Chinese society suddenly developed humanitarian concerns about systematic murder, but because live burial had become obviously incompatible with the empire's other goals and interests. Internal problems were mounting throughout the Tang period as China's growing complexity made the loss of skilled personnel increasingly costly. The empire's expanding infrastructure projects required experienced engineers, architects, and craftsmen who needed to survive their previous assignments to be available for new ones. Military expansion required experienced commanders and advisors who couldn't provide strategic expertise if they were buried with their previous employers. Economic development demanded skilled artisans and administrators whose premature death created bottlenecks that slowed growth and innovation. External pressures also contributed to the practice's decline. China's increasing integration with international trade networks meant that foreign perceptions of Chinese civilization affected economic relationships and diplomatic negotiations. Trading partners from the Islamic world, Byzantine Empire, and emerging European kingdoms found live burial practices disturbing and sometimes used them as justification for avoiding or limiting commercial relationships with China. The Silk Roads expansion made China more dependent on international cooperation, creating incentives to adopt practices that foreign partners found acceptable. The role of individuals versus historical forces created interesting debates among later Chinese historians. Some argued that specific emperors like Zhao and Xuanzong deserve credit for personally driving reform through their policy decisions. Others contended that live burial would have ended regardless of individual leadership because it had become incompatible with China's economic and social development. The truth probably involved both individual decisions and broader historical trends, working together to eliminate an increasingly obsolete practice. What could have been done differently was a question that interested Chinese administrative theorists for centuries. Some argued that live burial could have been eliminated much earlier if reformers had focused on moral arguments rather than practical considerations. Others suggested that the gradual approach was necessary to avoid social disruption and religious conflict. A few contended that live burial served important social functions that were lost when the practice ended, though they struggled to explain what those functions might have been. The inevitability versus contingency debate revealed fundamental disagreements about how social change occurred. Confucian scholars generally argued that the end of live burial was inevitable because the practice violated fundamental principles of human governance and social harmony. Legalist thinkers suggested that the change was contingent on specific policy decisions and could have been reversed by different imperial choices. Taoist philosophers maintained that the transformation was part of natural social evolution that couldn't have been prevented or accelerated. Perhaps most significantly, the end of live burial demonstrated that even deeply entrenched cultural practices could disappear when they became incompatible with other social goals. The practice had persisted for over a millennium, not because it was particularly effective or beneficial, but because it had become embedded in institutional structures and cultural expectations that made change difficult. Once those supporting structures evolved to prioritize economic development and international cooperation over traditional burial practices, live burial became an obvious candidate for elimination. The economic analysis that drove the original reforms proved remarkably prescient. The accumulated benefits of preserving skilled workers, increased productivity, technological innovation, institutional knowledge retention became so obvious that defending live burial required ignoring clear evidence of its costs. Even the most tradition-minded officials found it difficult to argue for practices that demonstrably weakened the empire they were supposed to serve. The immediate aftermath of live burial's end was characterized by what historians called the Great Exhale, a collective sigh of relief that swept through Chinese society as people realized they no longer needed to worry about being murdered for someone else's funeral arrangements. Palace employment applications increased dramatically as skilled workers discovered that royal service no longer carried significant mortality risks. Court positions that had previously been difficult to fill suddenly attracted qualified candidates who could plan long-term careers without expecting them to end abruptly and permanently, who stepped into the vacuum left by the disappearance of live burial were primarily artists, engineers, and administrators who specialized in creating elaborate burial alternatives. The clay figure industry expanded rapidly, employing thousands of craftsmen who developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for creating lifelike burial companions. Mechanical device manufacturers emerged to provide automated tomb entertainment and security systems. Architectural specialists focused on designing tomb complexes that emphasized artistic achievement and technological innovation rather than human sacrifice. Short-term consequences included immediate improvements in palace morale, increased applications for skilled positions, and a renaissance in funeral arts that emphasized creativity over killing. Court musicians could develop long-term relationships with imperial patrons without worrying about eternal employment obligations. Architects could take pride in their tomb designs without expecting to become permanent residents. Administrative efficiency improved as officials could focus on governance rather than organizing mass murder. Contemporary actions varied by social position and cultural background. Court officials expressed relief at no longer having to organize systematic killing as part of their administrative duties. Craftsmen and artists celebrated their improved life expectancy and career prospects. Religious leaders praised the moral progress while taking credit for spiritual guidance that had supposedly influenced the change. Foreign observers noted the improvements approvingly, though some expressed surprise that it had taken Chinese civilization so long to figure out that not killing people was generally preferable to killing them. Attempts at revival were occasional and unsuccessful. Some traditional families tried to maintain live burial practices for private funerals, but they found little support from communities that had moved beyond the practice. Regional nobles who attempted to preserve local burial traditions discovered that their behavior was now viewed as backward and embarrassing rather than honorable and traditional. The social and economic infrastructure that had once supported live burial had evolved beyond the point where revival was practically possible, even for those who might have preferred the old ways. The new normal that emerged emphasized artistic achievement, technological innovation, and economic efficiency rather than human sacrifice, creating a foundation for the cultural flowering that characterized later Chinese dynasties. The legacy of live burial practices shaped Chinese culture in ways that persisted long after the last burial victim was sealed in a tomb, creating patterns of thinking about authority, loyalty, and individual value that influenced Chinese society for over a millennium. Later generations viewed the practice with a mixture of fascination and horror that revealed as much about their own values as it did about their ancestors' methods of funeral planning. The Tang Dynasty historians who first systematically documented live burial practices treated them as examples of ancient barbarism that enlightened rulers had wisely abandoned. Their accounts emphasized the economic waste and social disruption caused by systematic murder, while generally avoiding moral judgments about the inherent wrongness of killing people for ceremonial purposes. This approach established a pattern of Chinese historical analysis that focused on practical consequences rather than ethical principles, influencing how later scholars evaluated other controversial policies and practices. Song Dynasty philosophers incorporated the history of live burial into broader discussions about the relationship between individual rights and social obligations. Confucian scholars use the practice as an example of how traditional customs could become corrupted when they lost sight of their original purposes, while Neo-Confucian thinkers argued that the elimination of live burial demonstrated the possibility of moral progress through rational analysis. These philosophical frameworks influenced Chinese political thinking for centuries, establishing precedents for evaluating traditional practices based on their contemporary utility rather than their historical precedent. Ming Dynasty administrators studied live burial history as part of their training in governmental efficiency and policy analysis. The transformation from human sacrifice to clay figure alternatives became a case study in successful reform that achieved traditional goals through innovative methods. Administrative manuals from this period frequently referenced burial reform as an example of how institutional change could be implemented without social disruption or loss of cultural authenticity. This approach to gradual reform became characteristic of Chinese governance, influencing everything from tax policy to military organization. The artistic impact was equally significant. The clay figure techniques developed as alternatives to live burial evolved into sophisticated sculptural traditions that influenced Chinese art for centuries. The terracotta army that accompanies Qin Shi Huang's tomb, ironically created by craftsmen who were subsequently buried alive, became a model for later burial art that emphasized artistic achievement over human sacrifice. The mechanical devices and architectural innovations that emerged from burial reform contributed to broader technological development that enhanced Chinese engineering capabilities. Myths versus realities that developed around live burial practices created their own cultural legacy. Popular stories emphasize the loyalty and devotion of burial victims, while downplaying the coercion and systematic murder that characterized most cases. Folktales transformed unwilling victims into heroic volunteers who eagerly embraced eternal service, creating a romanticized version of the practice that obscured its actual horror. These myths influenced Chinese concepts of loyalty and duty in ways that made absolute obedience to authority seem more noble and natural than it probably was. Why the practice remained important in cultural memory, despite its elimination, revealed deep tensions in Chinese thinking about tradition and progress. Later dynasties took pride in having abandoned live burial while simultaneously celebrating the devotion and loyalty that the practice was supposed to represent. Chinese culture developed a complex relationship with its own history that allowed it to condemn specific practices while praising the values they were supposed to embody. The international reputation consequences persisted long after live burial ended. Foreign accounts of Chinese civilization continued to reference the practice as evidence of either Chinese barbarism or Chinese capacity for moral progress, depending on the author's perspective and agenda. These external perceptions influenced how China approached international relations and cultural exchange, creating incentives to emphasize the reforms rather than the original practices when presenting Chinese civilization to foreign audiences. Perhaps most significantly, the history of live burial became part of Chinese discussions about the proper relationship between tradition and innovation that influenced policy debates throughout Chinese history. The successful elimination of an ancient practice through gradual reform, rather than revolutionary change, became a model for later social transformations, establishing patterns of institutional evolution that characterized Chinese approaches to modernization well into the contemporary period. Today, we can see echoes of ancient Chinese live burial practices in modern workplace dynamics that would be hilarious if they weren't so depressingly familiar to anyone who's ever worked in a large organization. The fundamental pattern: skilled workers being systematically destroyed by the institutions they serve, has simply evolved from literal burial to metaphorical forms of professional death that are arguably more sophisticated and definitely more prolonged than their ancient predecessors. Consider the modern phenomenon of knowledge hoarding in corporate environments, where companies invest heavily in training skilled employees only to create conditions that encourage those same employees to leave, taking their expertise with them. Is like a contemporary version of burial reform, except instead of clay figures replacing human workers, we have AI systems and offshore contractors replacing experienced employees who've been efficiently eliminated through layoffs, restructuring, and optimization initiatives. The economic irrationality is remarkably similar. Organizations deliberately destroying their own human capital for short-term benefits that prove counterproductive in the long run. The tech industry provides particularly clear parallels to ancient Chinese burial practices. Software companies routinely hire brilliant engineers to work on innovative projects, then eliminate entire teams when those projects are completed or when new management decides to pursue different strategic directions. The engineers aren't literally buried alive, but their careers are often effectively ended when they're laid off from high-profile projects, blacklisted for questioning company decisions, or pushed out through workplace cultures that make staying impossible. It's like Emperor Qin Shi Huang's approach to tomb security, except instead of burying architects to protect construction secrets, modern companies destroy teams to protect intellectual property or reduce labor costs. The gig economy has created its own version of systematic worker disposal that mirrors ancient Chinese patterns of treating skilled labor as disposable. Platform companies like Uber, DoorDash, and TaskRabbit rely on skilled workers to provide their services while maintaining that these workers aren't really employees who deserve job security, benefits, or career development. The workers provide essential skills that make the platforms profitable, then are efficiently discarded when they're no longer needed or when economic conditions change. It's essentially live burial for the digital age, systematic elimination of the people who create value, dressed up as entrepreneurial opportunity and worker flexibility. Academic institutions provide another fascinating parallel. Universities hire brilliant graduate students and postdoctoral researchers to conduct groundbreaking research, then systematically eliminate most of them through tenure-track hiring processes that select only a tiny fraction of qualified candidates. The rest are essentially buried alive in adjunct positions or forced to leave academia entirely, taking their expertise and training with them. The universities maintain their research productivity by constantly cycling through new cohorts of skilled workers who are trained, exploited, and discarded in patterns that would have been familiar to ancient Chinese craftsmen. Healthcare systems demonstrate similar patterns, particularly in how they treat nursing staff and resident physicians. Hospitals rely on skilled healthcare workers to provide patient care, then create working conditions, excessive hours, inadequate staffing, bureaucratic obstacles, emotional trauma that systematically burn out these same workers and force them to leave the profession. The healthcare system essentially buries its own human capital alive through workplace practices that make retention impossible, then complains about staffing shortages as if they were natural disasters rather than predictable consequences of institutional policies. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency of powerful institutions to treat skilled workers as disposable resources rather than valuable assets worth preserving and developing. The specific methods have evolved from literal burial to layoffs, burnout, hostile work environments, and economic insecurity. But the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Organizations benefit from skilled labor, then find ways to eliminate the people who provide that labor when it becomes convenient or profitable to do so. Similar patterns in different contexts appear throughout modern society. Political campaigns hire talented staffers to win elections, then discard most of them immediately after victory. Entertainment companies sign promising artists to contracts that give them extensive creative control, then systematically undermine their careers when they become inconvenient or expensive. Military organizations train soldiers for specialized roles, then eliminate their positions through budget cuts and strategic restructuring that waste the investment in human development. The lessons for contemporary issues are clear. The economic irrationality of destroying your own human capital is as obvious now as it was in ancient China. But institutional incentives often reward short-term efficiency over long-term sustainability. Modern organizations could learn from Chinese burial reform that preserving skilled workers and institutional knowledge produces better outcomes than constantly starting over with new personnel. Even now, the history of Chinese live burial practices influences modern areas in ways that most people don't recognize, creating subtle but persistent effects on how we think about loyalty, authority, and the value of individual life versus institutional needs. Academic study of ancient Chinese burial practices has become a standard component of courses on Chinese history, anthropology, and comparative civilizations, influencing how scholars understand the relationship between cultural traditions and social change. Popular culture has embraced the dramatic potential of live burial stories while generally sanitizing their historical reality. Movies, television shows, and novels set in ancient China frequently reference burial practices as background elements that demonstrate the exotic nature of historical Chinese civilization, though they typically emphasize individual acts of heroic sacrifice rather than systematic institutional murder. Video games set in ancient China often include burial themes as plot elements, allowing players to experience dramatized versions of historical events without confronting their actual horror. Political discourse occasionally references Chinese burial practices as examples of how traditional cultures can evolve beyond their most problematic elements, though these references are usually superficial and often inaccurate. Policy debates about institutional reform sometimes invoke burial reform as evidence that gradual change is preferable to revolutionary transformation. Though the analogy is rarely developed in useful detail, social movements focused on workplace rights and labor organizations sometimes reference historical patterns of worker exploitation, including Chinese burial practices, as examples of how institutional power can be used to destroy the people who create value for organizations. These references are typically metaphorical rather than literal, but they tap into deeper concerns about the relationship between individual welfare and institutional success. Why people still care about ancient Chinese burial practices probably has less to do with historical curiosity than with contemporary anxiety about being buried alive by modern institutions. The stories resonate because they dramatize fears about workplace exploitation, economic insecurity, and institutional power that remain relevant today. The historical distance makes these concerns safe to explore without directly challenging contemporary power structures. The archaeological impact continues as new discoveries provide additional information about burial practices and their social context. Recent excavations have revealed details about the lives of burial victims, the techniques used in live burial, and the economic costs of the practice that enhance our understanding of ancient Chinese society while providing new material for contemporary discussions about institutional reform and social change. Educational curricula increasingly include discussion of Chinese burial practices as examples of how cultural analysis can inform contemporary policy debates. Though the connections are often abstract rather than practical, the enduring fascination with Chinese live burial practices suggests that these historical events touch on fundamental questions about human nature, institutional power, and social change that remain relevant regardless of specific cultural or temporal context. The stories of craftsmen buried with emperors, escape attempts by condemned palace workers, and gradual reform that eliminated systematic murder provide a lens for examining contemporary issues about workplace exploitation, institutional loyalty, and the costs of tradition. But perhaps the most important lesson from this historical journey isn't about ancient China at all. It's about how human societies can recognize and eliminate their most destructive practices while maintaining cultural continuity and institutional effectiveness. The Chinese approach to burial reform offers a model for addressing contemporary problems that require fundamental change without revolutionary disruption. As we conclude our exploration of what it was like to be buried alive in ancient China, the question isn't just what these practices reveal about historical Chinese civilization, but what they reveal about the persistent human challenges of balancing individual welfare with institutional needs, tradition with innovation, and cultural authenticity with moral progress. The answers aren't simple, but the questions remain as relevant today as they were over a millennium ago, when the last burial victims were sealed in imperial tombs. Looking back across more than 2 millennia of Chinese burial practices, we've witnessed one of history's most remarkable transformations. How a civilization systematically eliminated its most elaborate form of institutional murder while maintaining detailed records that let us understand exactly what happened and why. From Emperor Qin Shi Huang's paranoid mass burials to the eventual adoption of clay figure alternatives, this journey reveals patterns of change that are both uniquely Chinese and universally human. The most surprising discoveries included the sophisticated bureaucracy that made mass live burial possible, the elaborate escape networks that developed in response, and how quickly Chinese society adapted once reforms began. These weren't chaotic massacres, but carefully planned operations with quality control measures and detailed documentation, simultaneously impressive and horrifying. Perhaps most fascinating was how live burial created exactly the opposite of what it intended. Designed to demonstrate loyalty and preserve secrets, it actually created disloyalty and elaborate information networks. The escape attempts and resistance that emerged transformed Chinese society in ways nobody had planned or anticipated. The transformation to clay figure alternatives wasn't just about funeral practices. It was a masterclass in maintaining cultural continuity while eliminating destructive elements. Chinese reformers found ways to preserve symbolic and spiritual functions while eliminating human costs, creating solutions that satisfied both traditionalists and reformers. It was progress achieved through practical thinking rather than moral awakening. Our final story centers on master craftsman Zhou Ming, whose career spanned the transition from expecting death after imperial projects to living long enough to train his grandson in clay figure creation. His workshop diary documents the psychological liberation that came with burial reform. Early entries preparing for death, later ones planning a career. His most moving entry describes attending Emperor Zhao's funeral as an honored guest rather than a burial victim. Watching clay figures he'd helped create served the emperor while he returned home to train the next generation. Zhou Ming's grandson became one of the Tang period's most celebrated burial artists, transforming an industry from death management to artistic creation. This represents thousands of similar stories, individual lives completely transformed by institutional change, skilled work evolving from death sentence to family profession. The most memorable image from Zhou Ming's story is his description of teaching his grandson to paint peaceful, content faces on burial figures. These clay servants will never know fear, hunger, or sorrow. They are better burial companions than we living craftsmen ever were, because they were designed for the purpose rather than conscripted into it. This captures the essential transformation, replacing unwilling human victims with purpose-built alternatives that better served everyone's needs. The clay figures were more suitable for eternal service because they were created specifically for that role, while living craftsmen were more valuable alive because they could create, teach, and innovate. As we dim the lights on this journey, the most peaceful thought is that Zhou Ming's grandson never had to worry about being buried alive for doing excellent work, and that thousands of families eventually shared that same quiet security. Sometimes the greatest victories are simply the absence of terrible things that once seemed inevitable. The soft background hum of that fan reminds us that some stories end not with drama, but with the simple relief of no longer having to be afraid.